Hello, everyone. Hopefully people are starting to come into the webinar session now. I can see the numbers ticking up. Hello, a very, very warm welcome to this Cultural Learning Alliance webinar, the second in a series of opportunities programmed by CLA co-chairs Sally Bacon and Derri Burdon to share key pieces of research and thinking with the CLA membership. I'm Jacqui O'Hanlon. I'm Deputy Executive Director at the RSC and also an Evidence Associate with the Cultural Learning Alliance. And this evening, I'm delighted to be hosting this webinar, which focuses on the 2025 CLA report card. I'm just going to set a little bit of context for this webinar. Then I'm going to introduce all of the panelists that are going to be talking with us this evening about the report card and the findings. Then just introduce the structure, and then we'll get cracking. So I suppose two important pieces of context that we will know about from last month that really shed a big light on the report card findings are the publication of the interim curriculum and assessment report in March, and alongside that publication, the news that a National Centre for the Arts and Music Education will be established in September 2026. So the interim curriculum and assessment report, there's a few key things that it feels important to pull out in the context of the report card findings. One, definitely an acknowledgement that the system isn't delivering for every child. Also an acknowledgement about long-held concerns that have been around in the education and cultural sector about the EBAC. The report says responses to the call for evidence suggest that the EBAC performance measures may unnecessarily constrain the choice of students, impacting their engagement and achievement and limiting their access to and the time available for vocational and art subjects. And the curriculum and assessment review expert panel further say that they're going to continue to assess the EBAC, paying close attention to the evidence of its impact on young people's choices and outcomes and on institutional, i.e. school behaviours. Another interesting reflection, perhaps, in the context of the report card is about parent, carer and pupil choice. So the curriculum and assessment review included polling data from parents, carers and students across Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4. And that polling asked which from a list of subject areas the parent, carer or child would like to spend more time on. And it's interesting to see that 38% of parents or carers and a quarter of young people said they wanted to spend more time on subjects that involved creative thinking and problem-solving projects. Around a third of parents or carers and young people would like more attention to life skills, to the development of life skills. And then 19% of parents and carers said they wanted more opportunities for their children to participate in cultural activities, art, music, drama, media. Curriculum review also highlighted representation, making clear that the curriculum needs to do more to ensure all young people feel represented. It made clear that pupils told the review panel not being able to see themselves in the content they learn about is disempowering and demotivating. So the report makes a clear commitment to the need for diverse perspectives and representation in curriculum content. Of course, some important omissions that we might hear about through the session today, including Oracy. But as I said, alongside the interim report, an announcement about the establishment of a national centre for arts and music education, due to launch in September 26. It will be tasked with promoting arts education, supporting arts teaching, and bolstering collaboration between schools and arts organisations. So potentially a really big opportunity, depending on the length of the funding model and the kind of strategic thinking, long-term strategic thinking that can really support. but a very active and fast-changing external context in which to be discussing tonight the 2025 CLA report card. So to help us do that, I'm just going to ask all of the panellists that we have with us tonight to introduce themselves, starting with Baz, or starting with Sally.
Hi there, Jacqui, thank you. My name's Sally Bacon. I have a background in arts, education and philanthropy, and I'm founder and co-chair of the Cultural Learning Alliance. Delighted to be with you all.
Thank you, Sally. Derri.
I'm Derri Burdon. I'm the other co-chair of the Cultural Learning Alliance, and I'm also CEO at arts education charity Curious Minds. My background is in enrichment for learning in the main.
Derri. And Geoff.
Yeah, evening everyone. Geoff Barton, English teacher by background, a head teacher of a comprehensive school for 15 years, then a trade union leader of the ASCL Leadership Union for 7 years. For the past year, I've been chairing a commission on Oracy, how do we promote speaking and listening skills in education more, and I'm also a trustee of the Royal Shakespeare Company.
Thank you, Geoff. And Baz.
Evening, everyone. I'm Baz Ramaiah, formerly Head of Policy at the Cultural Learning Alliance, now a Policy and Evidence Associate at the CLA. And I was the lead author of the previous report card and also the lead author of the report card that I'll be presenting on this evening.
Thanks, Baz. And Ed.
Hi, I'm Ed Harlow. I'm a music teacher in secondary school, head of music, and I'm also Vice President of the National Education Union.
Thank you, Ed. Welcome. And Janet.
Hi, I'm Janet Goodier. I'm a deputy head teacher in a secondary school in the Northwest. I'm a music teacher and I've previously been a head of arts that has led my arts faculty to be Arts Platinum School.
Thanks very much and welcome, Janet. So the structure for the session is, in a minute, I'm going to hand over to Baz, who is going to lead us through an overview of the CLA 2025 report card. As Baz is speaking, we've got enabled the Q&A function or the chat function. So whichever you are more comfortable with using, please post any questions that you'd particularly like to pose to any of the panellists in response to the report card. Once Baz has presented, I'll then ask all of the panellists to make their own individual reflections in response to what they've heard. Then we'll open up to answering the questions that you have, and that will really take us through to the end of the session. So Baz, over to you, please.
Thanks, Jacqui, and thanks to all of you for being here this evening. I am just going to share my screen. I can't see anyone. Can someone tell me if they can see this? Is this good? People see?
Good?
Yes.
Yeah.
Lovely. I don't seem to be able to change. Oh, there we go. There we go. So it's just catching up now. So I am just going to give you all a overview of the latest report card, some of the background to the production of this report card to kind of set the scene, and then also some of the headlines in terms of our findings to set up the discussion this evening. So we might start off by setting out why the Cultural Learning Alliance report card exists. Well, in all my time working at the CLA, and for many years preceding that, there was this strong ambient sense in the arts education sector that the arts were being squeezed out of schools, were having this diminishing role in schools. We were monitoring and collecting some of that data at CLA in terms of diminishing entries into art subjects at GCSE and A-level. But I think there was this sense that the arts are being squeezed out of schools, but that there also wasn't some of the hard data to back up that sense, aggregated and collected into one place to show a kind of comprehensive picture of the of where the arts were in schools. So that's what we set out to do at the CLA, was to put together a document that brought together all those myriad different streams of data to show what was going on with arts in schools, properly mapping out what the problem is to set the stage for pushing for a solution and pushing for policy change. So that's how the report card initially came about. So we worked closely at CLA with our members, but also key stakeholders in the arts education space to agree a set of indicators, which we would monitor and collect data on every single year and use those as a proxy for looking at how the presence of arts in schools. So I've listed these indicators out here, and that's going to be the data that I'm going to be going through this evening is going to be in relation to these 5 indicators. So indicator 1 is arts GCSE entries and also other entries at the level 2 level for vocational subjects in arts. Indicator 2 is arts A-level entries and also other level 3 vocational arts entries as well as higher education progression in creative subjects. Indicator 2 is quite a broad field. The third indicator is the number of arts teachers in schools and also the number of hours of arts subjects taught. Indicator 4 is arts teacher recruitment and retention in any given year. And indicator 5 is what we call the arts entitlement gap and the arts enrichment gap, which are both terms that I'll spell out a bit more clearly when we come to discussing the data on that indicator. So our first report card kind of zoomed out and took this kind of long lens view on all of these indicators and how the data had changed in relation to them between 2010 and 2023, 2024. The idea there was that we had to pick a starting point for looking at this data, and what we wanted to build was a picture of how, since the 2010 change in government and all the accompanying changes to education policy, how has the presence of arts changed in schools as a consequence of some of those policy changes. Just sharing some of the findings from that report card from last year, there were some really stark figures in there. Just to give you a sense of some of them, between 2010 and 2023, an overall decline of 42% in the number of arts GCSE entries. At A-level, a decline in that same time period of 21% in arts entries. In terms of higher education, a 6% decrease in the number of students studying for an undergraduate degree in creative arts and design subjects between 2010 and 2023. In that time period, a 14% fall in the number of arts teachers. And in terms of initial teacher training, some significant decreases in the number of ITT entrants in art subjects, 56% in music, 90% art and design, 65% in design and technology. So there's a really stark picture of long-term decline there in terms of the arts in schools from that first report card. Which brings us on to the report card for this year. What's different about the report card this year compared to last year? Well, the focus, as will be the case moving forward with successive editions of the report card, is on data between the last academic year and this academic year in terms of what data is available. The idea is to monitor how data in relation to these indicators changes from year on year. This year we are including some new data for indicator 1 and indicator 2, where we've been looking at level 2 and level 3 vocational and technical qualifications as well. We really did feel that was something missing from our analysis last year in terms of showing a kind of more complete picture of what's going on at the end of Key Stage 4 and at the end of Key Stage 5 for young people. We've also done some new analysis this year where we've been looking at local and regional poverty indices and how these relate to entries at GCSE and at A-levels as well. And in terms of our work on indicator 5 for the enrichment gap, we use a kind of literature review based model for that, for putting evidence together on that indicator. And we've got a few new studies in there this year which look at not just the enrichment gap and the entitlement gap, but the consequence of that in terms of progression to careers in the creative industries. Just very briefly on the methodology, this is all detailed more thoroughly in the report card itself, but all of the data here that we draw on is from publicly available data sets. The majority of it is from the DfE Statistics Service, some of it is from HESA, and some of it is also from the ONS as well. With the exception, as I was saying, for indicator 5, which is about the entitlement gap and the enrichment gap. Some of that data is drawn from literature. Some of that's academically published literature, some of that's grey literature produced by think tanks such as the Education Policy Institute. We also used some ONS data to map out the entitlement gap as well, particularly specifically ONS data on multiple deprivation indices. I think we've always been very open at CLA about maybe some of the limitations in our data because we see this as an iterative process of gradually expanding what's in the report card each year to make this picture even more comprehensive. But just some to highlight here, which I think are relevant. Our focus is on England. There are some points where we gesture at what might be going on in the rest of the UK, but our focus is on England. There is a real, constraint on what data there is on primary schools when it comes to the composition of the curriculum in relation to the arts. The government and other services don't have any publicly available data on that. So as a consequence, in order to maintain the completeness and the detail in our picture, we focused on secondary schools. There is a lack of equalities analysis here. That data is all in the National People Database. It's a very long process to be able to get access to it. But so this means that we can't really do comparisons like, say, for example, like, are there more children with SEND who are studying certain art subjects? Are children with, English as an additional language less likely to study art subjects, that kind of thing? That is something that sometimes Ofqual might publish like a briefing on, but unless they do, it's not something that we have presently included in this report card. And then similarly, we are constrained by the fact that the government's reporting of data on dance is scandalously and tragically often lacking. For example, they often don't report data in relation for dance in relation to teacher, the number of dance teachers, and equally dance teacher recruitment and retention as well. So having set the scene, I'll dive into some of the findings. So looking at indicator 1, which is GCSE entries and also level 2 vocational entries as well. Broadly, across all GCSE subjects, there's actually been an increase in the total number of GCSE subjects. There's been nearly a 5% increase in entries. But moving in the opposite direction, there's actually been a 0.15% decrease in expressive arts entries. And this is really important to us because it's not just that, it's not just that expressive arts entries are falling at GCSE because there's fewer and fewer GCSEs being sat each year. Actually, what we see is the opposite. We see that the trend is that the number of GCSE entries has been increasing for quite some time, but the number of entries in art subjects has been generally moving in the opposite direction and decreasing. The biggest falls between 23 and 24 have been in media, film, TV studies, just under 21%. Fewer entries in the most recent year there's data available for, and in dance where there's 5.6% fewer entries. There's actually been a slight increase in entries in some art subjects. The one that caught a reasonable amount of press attention was the 7.1% increase in music. I think that's certainly, on paper, a good thing. I guess we would just preface this by saying we would want to see the data next year and the year after that to see whether this is a long-term trajectory in terms of an upward tick in music entries. It's very hard to make that judgment just from the data in 1 year. There's been an overall fall in other level 2 vocational entries in arts, a decline of 40% in art and design subjects, 34% in music between 2023 and 2024. This is important because I guess one of the kind of hypotheses that's often considered in this area is that, GCSE arts entries might be declining because pupils are being moved on to other vocational entries, but this doesn't seem to be the case from the data from the last couple of years at any rate. Again, zooming out a little bit, taking a wide lens here and looking back to 2010, it was the case in 2010 that about 14% of all GCSE entries were in expressive arts subjects. That figure now sits at just under 7% at 6.8%. So there's been a significant decline in the kind of composition of all GCSE entries that are made up of arts. New for this year is some of our work looking at the entries at the regional and at the local authority level and how this relates to poverty at the regional and at the local authority level. So the highest proportion of expressive arts entries in GCSE in any given region in England were in the southwest and in the southeast. These are both the regions that, according to the Department for Education, have the lowest percentage of pupils who are eligible for free school meals. By contrast, entries into expressive arts were at the lowest in a given region in Yorkshire and the Humber, the North East and the West Midlands, with the North East and the West Midlands being the two regions that have the highest percentage of pupils eligible for free school meals. So there does look, at first glance, to be some association between poverty in any given region and the makeup of GCSE entries in that region in relation to arts. Looking at the local authority level and using the multiple deprivation index, we can see that local authorities that have have higher levels of deprivation also correspondingly have a lower proportion of their GCSE entries made up of arts. And similarly, local authorities that are more affluent have a higher proportion of their GCSE entries made up by the arts. So this definitely is all strongly suggestive evidence of a relationship between poverty and entries into art subjects at GCSE. For indicator 2, which is, as I say, a broad field that covers A-levels, level 3 vocational qualifications, and HE progression, the number of A-level expressive art entries has actually fallen by 1.3% between 2023 and 2024. Biggest falls have been in drama and also media, film, and TV studies. Similarly, for other level 3 technical and vocational qualifications, there's also been a fall, 4% for performing arts, 17% in crafts, creative art and design, and 9% in media and communication. Again, to our previous hypothesis about the fact that there might be some diverting of students from A levels onto other level 3 qualifications. It doesn't look like it's being the case, perhaps in light of the current crisis around level 3 qualifications. And again, if we zoom out and we look at 2010 to now, the actual number of A-level entries across all subjects has increased by 1.3%. But in specific art subjects, there's been huge falls in that time period, 48% in drama, 43% in music, 41% in design and technology. So this is an overall long-term picture of decline. Looking at the regional and the local authority data again, so A-level entries in expressive arts subjects are lowest in terms of the proportion that they make up of the total number of A-level entries in the North East, the West Midlands, and the Northwest, which are all regions of the country with the highest proportion of free school meal eligible pupils. By contrast, expressive art entries are the highest in the Southeast and the Southwest, which have the lowest proportion of free school meal eligible pupils. So we're seeing that same pattern again as with GCSEs. That pattern also extends to local authority multiple deprivation index data, where across the most deprived fifth of local authorities, expressive arts make up 4.2% of all entries at A level. By contrast, in the most affluent fifth of local authorities, that's 5.4%. So there's a real disparity there. On the HE front, there's a couple of stats I've not included here, but I'm happy to talk about as part of the discussion. But yeah, the key headline is that there has been a nearly a 2% fall in the number of creative arts and design undergraduates from 2023. From 2022 to 2023. So yeah, this is also a dwindling, another space in which arts education is dwindling. In terms of the number of arts teachers, there's been a slight increase in the number of teachers for most expressive arts subjects. Again, I would just preface this as we're doing the report card by saying, year-to-year changes can just be random fluctuation. They can be measurement errors. So we do need to see the data next year and the year after, because overall, the long-term picture here is one of decline. As I've highlighted here, between 2011, which is the first year the DfE has publicly available data on, and 2024, the actual overall secondary teacher workforce grew by nearly 7%. By contrast, the number of expressive arts teachers fell in that time period by 27%. So there's a real long-term picture of decline here. And although, this slight uptick might be welcome, we have to see how this data takes shape over the coming years before we can be too optimistic, I think. Similar picture in terms of art subjects, in terms of taught hours. There's not been a huge change in terms of taught hours at Key Stage 3. Where there have been changes in taught hours at Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5, these largely correspond to fluctuations in entries. So there's been a slight increase in the number of taught hours in art and design at Key Stage 4 and similarly in music, but there's also been a slight increase in the number of entries in art and design and music at GCSE. So I don't think that's particularly remarkable. Similarly at A level as well, where there's been an increase in taught hours at Key Stage 5 there's been a decrease in taught hours for drama at Key Stage 5, which is largely in line with the decline in entries there as well. Looking at arts teacher recruitment and retention, there's a few different time points we pick in the report for comparison, but an interesting point of comparison from our perspective is that there was a kind of a sort of period in the sort of start of the pandemic, 2020-21, that academic year, where there was this huge uptick in the number of ITT entrants, as is often the case in a recession. So if we use that as a starting point compared to now, then the figures in terms of the fall in ITT entrants in art subjects is really stark. So we're talking about an 84% fall, for example, in the number of art and design ITT entrants between 2021 and 2024. Also really big falls over that same time period for music, drama, design and technology. And even if we just look from 2023 to 2024, on average, we're talking about a 30% fall in the number of ITT recruits across expressive art subjects. So this is a really significant issue. And you know, I don't think it'll surprise anyone in light of those figures to see that the government is wildly missing its own ITT recruitment targets, for example, in art and design, where it's only met 44%, and it's only met 27% of those targets for music and design and technology. So these are really staggering figures. We use a few different figures to kind of estimate teacher retention. One is the overall number of vacancies in any given subject, and we can see that between 2023 and 2024, there have been some big increases in the number of vacancies in art subjects, unfilled teaching vacancies in art subjects. For example, in drama, there were 41% more unfilled vacancies in 2024 than there were in 2023. We also use the government's vacancy rate as a measure to look at teacher retention as well. And we can see that the vacancy rate has increased in art design, drama, and media studies from 2023 to 2024. And I should also just flag that those vacancy rates are very high. They are actually, in the case of drama and music, they're actually higher than subjects like biology, which the government has, like, you know, designated strategies for building up the workforce, the teaching workforce on. So this is a real concern. Finally, the arts entitlement gap and the arts enrichment gap. So in relation to the entitlement gap, we're talking about the difference between pupils who are from more affluent backgrounds and their access to study arts formally in schools, and, you know, pupils who are from a more disadvantaged background and their ability to access and study arts in school. This is all data that we covered as part of Indicator 1 and Indicator 2, but just to quickly refresh everyone, we can see that there's, you know, 6.6% of all GCSE entries in art subjects in the most deprived fifth of local authorities, but 8.3% of all GCSE entries in art subjects in the least deprived, the most affluent fifth of local authorities. The picture is very similar at A level as well. In terms of the enrichment gap and where, which is kind of, you know, the access that children who are from more affluent backgrounds have towards studying arts as an extracurricular activity compared to children who are from more disadvantaged backgrounds and their access. There's a range of new studies that we pick out in this report card, but I'll just share a few here which look at some of that disparity and also some of the consequences of that disparity. So there was some new research in the last year by the Education Policy Institute which highlighted that children in independent schools are actually much more likely to attend extracurricular arts and music activities than children in any type of state school. Similarly, students who are eligible for free school meals are much less likely than their peers who are not eligible for free school meals to attend arts and music activities. So there's a real kind of enrichment gap there. In terms of the consequence of both the entitlement gap and the arts enrichment gap, a couple of pieces of research from the last year. The Sutton Trust, in a recent report, showed that young adults from working class backgrounds are 4 times less likely to work in the creative industries compared to their middle class peers. And similarly, research by the Labour Party just before the general election last year highlighted that 40% of British nominees for the Oscars, BAFTAs and Mercury Awards since 2014 have been privately educated, which if you compare to the base rate for being privately educated in this country is 7%. So there's a clear relationship. There's important evidence here about how access to arts shapes young people's ability to progress to careers in the creative industries, but also to succeed in the creative industries as well. So what is to be done? I will gloss over some of this because I believe that Sally and Derri are the kind of like authority on the policy change that we want in this area. But I think things that are clear are something that is central here is setting a new purpose for education, which situates arts at its core. Making the case for something like a statutory arts entitlement for perhaps a minimum of 4 hours for secondary age pupils in Key Stage 3. complete reform to the school accountability system. I'm sure one of the things we're going to talk about like a bit this evening is the EBAC and its kind of a nefarious role in reducing the number of pupils who participate in arts GCSEs, and of course kind of bolstering the workforce through an entitlement to teacher training and expressive arts subjects. Similarly, one of the great and exciting things Sally and the kind of CLA policy and evidence working group have been putting together is mapping all the different benefits of an arts-rich education to help the sector articulate why this is important and why it matters. So agency, well-being, communication, empathy, collaboration, creativity, certain interpretive cognitive skills such as critical thinking, reflective judgment, that kind of thing. Yeah, I look forward to hearing more from Sally and Derri about this, and also hearing from the panel about all of the kind of findings on our report card. And so, yeah, I'll pause there. Thank you so much for listening. And yeah, do let me know if anyone has any questions.
Thank you very much, Baz, for a really detailed overview there of the report card. I'm going to go to each of the panelists because I'd like to ask each of them to make an initial overall reflection on something that feels particularly pertinent from that report card overview. Whilst each of them are doing that, for people that are in the webinar, delegates that are in the webinar, please do post any questions or comments or reflections, but particularly questions that you would like to pose to any of our panelists in response to the report card and the data that Baz has introduced. Just to let you know that we will be putting the webinar and the report card on the CLA's YouTube channel, so it will be available for you to go back to, or for people to watch who haven't been able to join the webinar this evening. So in terms of panelists, just making your initial something that really strikes you in response to that. Could I call in, I'm going to call in Derri first off, please, just to give us your initial response.
So much of it resonates and just sadly confirms what we probably already knew. But for me, it was the indicator 4 around teacher recruitment and retention that feels very pertinent this week, because we've just at Curious Minds, we advertised a post for a cultural education manager. We had over 90 applications for that job. Many of those applications came from teachers wanting to leave the profession. So I think there's a real crisis there, and a capacity issue that is going to take a long, I think Sally talks about we're turning around a juggernaut here, and I think not just that indicator, but all of them just confirm what we thought last year about the juggernaut is going to take a long time to turn around. But yeah, we just have had very clear evidence through that recruitment process that arts teachers are desperate to leave the profession, and we need to get under the skin of that to understand why.
Thank you, Derri. Sally, could you come in next with a reflection?
Sure, it's really hard to pick one thing. It's so content rich and so nuance rich, actually. I think for me, the finding that where a child grows up and their family's socioeconomic status being a significant social determinant in whether or not they'll pursue art subjects from the age of 14 feels huge. Just, we've always had a social justice lens. It feels like that lens is focusing so much more now. And literally on, there are 3 locations in the country that it's really lasering in on. I think we need to possibly look at London. We didn't touch on London in that presentation, Baz, because London is an outlier. DFE says it is always an outlier. That there's a whole project, a whole research project in London in itself, I suspect. And also coming back to Derri's point, if things changed tomorrow, if the EBAC went, or if the arts, if there was a broad and balanced education with the arts at the heart of it, if all of that changed tomorrow, things would not change tomorrow because of the workforce issue. It is going to, as Derri said, take such a long time to turn around.
Please do post any questions or comments that you'd like to make. Geoff, can I bring you in next, please?
Sure. I think it's a really impressive and forensically helpful report. And I think it's helpful for what it says and what it does. And I think it's helpful for what it doesn't say in this particular context. Let me just explain what I mean by that. So in terms of what it says, the fact you give us a historical perspective and show how did we get to here is really, really helpful. And for a new government, for them to see decisions of previous governments and the effects those have had is particularly timely, I think. I think the fact that you don't walk into some of the traps that we all can walk into of saying the arts are all about, you know, creativity, etc. And you make the point that this is about young people in deprived communities having less access to something which is going to help them to thrive and to flourish, for example, I think is incredibly helpful. So the report does that job very well. But my second point is what you don't say, and you don't say this because it's the stuff that's going on swirling around it. You've got a Prime Minister who in his first speech after becoming Prime Minister talks about the importance of the arts. You've got a Secretary of State who talks about wanting children, of course, to do well in exams, but also to thrive, to flourish and to belong. And part of our job, I think, is to say, so what does that mean in practice? You've got the curriculum review, which explicitly talks about the EBAC as being a problem. That is incredibly helpful, and talks about the arts in a way that we haven't had the arts talked about for donkey's years, which is helpful. You've got this rather bizarrely titled National Centre for Arts and Music Education. It's a bizarre title because most of us thought music was part of the arts. So to call it arts and music seems odd, and we don't quite know what it is, but it sounds like it's going to be constructive. And then you've got people like the NEU, this huge union saying the arts really matter, and teachers saying that they really matter. You've got people like Ed Sheeran here in Suffolk with a grassroots campaign around it. And then tonight, we've seen an appointment to Number 10 as their new lead advisor on skills of Ollie de Botton. Now, if you don't know Ollie de Botton, he comes from a background where most recently he's been working at what's it called, Careers and Enterprise Company. I did a podcast interview with him last year about Oracy, and what he says is this: the most important ingredient in social justice is a broad and balanced curriculum. And he's absolutely committed to the arts being part of that and Oracy being part of that. So you take the combination of what did you say in the report and what is the context we've got around the report. And last point, taking my cue from Margaret Thatcher, don't bring me problems, bring me solutions. It seems to me what the report is helping a new government to do is to bring solutions to how do we help children to thrive, to flourish and to feel that they belong.
Thank you, Geoff. Let's bring Ed in with dual hat, music teacher and NEU.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll just echo Geoff, you know, a really, really important piece of work. Baz said that a lot of what drove this piece of work was an ambient sense from the kind of profession and what was going on in schools. I would say it was a little more visceral sense, having, you know, being in school at the time. And again, you know, the thing that really stands out and the thing that makes it so difficult and will mean that this is going to take a long time to fix is that crisis in teacher training and teacher recruitment. But of course, if your, you know, level 3 A-level entries drop off a cliff by 48% in drama or 43% in music over 15 years, the pool of people who you can recruit into the profession has fallen apart. It's halved. And so I think that's you know, that's really takes some thought. I think there are some things, you know, it's helpful that the curriculum and assessment review talked about the EBAC, but I think the weight behind, you know, just getting rid of the EBAC, it costs nothing to get rid of. I think it would be a very symbolic thing that the government could do. And I think obviously the report doesn't go into the issues in primary, but there are issues in primary as well, because we now have new teachers coming into the profession who have been through this system for 15 years, where they have known cuts and decline in the arts and provision that has fallen apart. And many of our members are now telling us that they're not confident in primary schools to teach art, music, drama, and that many primaries have, you know, such a kind of laser focus at times on literacy, numeracy, and that's driven by the SAT. So it's not just the EBAC; it's about the whole how do we assess? What are the assessment regimes, and what are the accountability measures that are placed on schools, and how do they then impact on what we're seeing here. But yeah, I'd like to thank Baz again. It's a really important piece of work and some really, really stark figures, but sadly unsurprising for those of us who work in schools.
Thank you, Ed. I'm going to bring Janet in now before we then go to some of the questions and comments that have been coming through the chat and the Q&A. Janet, your reflection.
I think we've all been aware about the recruitment crisis in education for some time now, and we know that schools and trusts are working in far greater depth than they ever had been before. But you know, we've been focused on retention, but then you look at those stark figures for recruitment of new ITTs, and you know, it is scary to think about, even if government policy changes and curriculum changes, there won't be people to teach these subjects on the ground in schools moving forward. So, you know, I echo what Derri says about that future planning for our art subjects.
Thank you, Janet. We're going to now move to just getting some reflections and comments from people attending the webinar. So a first question that came has come from Speech Bubbles, which is about the primary situation. So Sally, could you take the question of what do we know about the situation in primary, please?
Yeah, we have to, at the start, as Baz said, at the start of each report card, we have to say what we don't know and what we can't tell anyone about, because we don't have the data. So we don't have the number of specialist teachers in primary. We don't have the number of arts hours taught in primary. It's why we were so thrilled to have Professor Pat Thompson's report, RAP's report on the arts in schools, that we held a webinar on a few weeks ago, because that, oh, thank goodness, we've got some information about primary. I mean, that's not, you know, from government data sets, it's not the kind of information we have here. But, you know, we don't want to be publishing a report card that is just about secondary. So we called in the last report card to the last government for there to be much more information gathered from primaries about this. Although obviously, you know, we're always worried about teacher workload and burden of things they have to do and collect and gather. And we've reissued that call in this report card. And in our blueprint for arts education, you'll have seen in the penultimate slide from Baz, the fourth very foundational ask we have is around an expressive arts teacher entitlement in teacher training and teacher development, actually. Ensuring opportunities for expressive arts subjects and a minimum level of arts training for primary teachers. So that feels really, really important. So yes, apologies, it's a big gap, and we can just need to keep knocking on that door to ask for the data so we can tell a full and comprehensive story about what we suspect will be a grim picture, as Ed hinted at, really. There is great work happening in some schools, we know that, and we say that in the report card. There will be brilliant arts work happening in some primaries, but we don't know enough, and we know there have been levers that haven't helped.
Thank you, Sally. And then Steve Cook, I think from Formby High School. Steve in the chat has talked about the EBAC being a spectre, and it's the biggest threat to the creative curriculum pathways, and even in a platinum arts mark school, they're feeling the pinch and the pressures. Janet, I wonder if I can bring you in on this, because you're also in an arts mark school, a platinum arts mark school, and what hope do you see in the interim curriculum and assessment review report, recognising that the EBAC is having a direct impact on the ability of students to make choices to study art subjects, expressive art subjects? Do you see that reflected in your school as well?
Yeah, I agree with what Steve says. You know, that every school in the country that is our Artsmart Platinum School is still feeling the pinch. I think with the curriculum review, at least it acknowledges that the EBAC is a barrier. And like what Geoff said, it allows the government to see what the current barrier is with the EBAC, and that will allow hopefully for an EBAC review and further within the curriculum review.
And do you think if the EBAC did either come away or that expressive arts subjects become part of Progress 8, will that make a big shift, do you feel?
I think it would. I think what the EVAC has done is that it has given children maybe one option choice, where we have, you know, we know that lots of students would pick multiple art subjects if they had the choice with their option subjects. So I do think that would massively increase the GCSE pickup.
Thank you very much, Janice.
Jacqui, would you mind if I just jump in on that? When I was I've talked to Becky Francis a few times about what she's doing. I've talked to officials at the DFE about stuff. And what I get reminded about is that what drives the stuff that people do in schools is often this ugly word, accountability, right? The EBAC is an example of that. And ultimately what we would want is to start with, so what do we want all young people to learn? The curriculum should come first. Then it's about professional agency of teachers saying, so how do I best teach that? And that'll be different according to different classes. So you start with curriculum, then you go to pedagogy. And then you look at assessment. So how do we assess whether they've learned that? And then you get to accountability. At the moment, accountability drives everything. And there's a little bit of a sense that what we need as a profession to do, I think, if this isn't too pompous of me, to say, let's get the curriculum stuff right, and let's do what's right for children and young people and influence that curriculum the very best we can, meanwhile working on an accountability measure which actually allows a Secretary of State to say, yes, this is about standards, so she's not getting attacked by the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph all the time, but it's also what parents would want, young people being given opportunities to flourish. And that whole notion of, so what does that mean? And what part does Ofsted play in that? I think we've got an opportunity to really try and do something around that now. We just need to be clear-sighted in what we're trying to achieve with it.
Thank you very much. Geoff, I think I was going to come back to you for another question, but Ed, I can see you've got your hand up, so please do come in.
I just want to come back on what Geoff just said, because he's absolutely right. And some of these accountability measures are, we're consistently putting the cart before the horse. But I would go one step further than Geoff, and I don't think it is just about the curriculum. I think we need a conversation in this country about what the purpose of education is, because I think even within the time since I left school, the purpose of education has shifted perceptibly. We have the President of the United States, right-hand man, openly calling for vast reform, technological reform of education. We have AI development, which is, as fast as anything we've ever had. The children that are in our schools are going to be competing for jobs with AI. And in many ways, our education system is preparing them not for a life in the 2030s, but for life in the 1930s. We still have, in many ways, quite a Victorian education system. And I think we need to have a real professional conversation about the purpose of education. And then, as Geoff says, what do we need children to learn? And to start with that, because at the moment, we have it completely the wrong way around. We have the changes driven by Ofsted, it's driven by accountability measures. That drives the assessment system, and the assessment system then drives every other decision that is made. And that is just, that's how we've ended up in the situation that we're in, I think.
Thank you very much. We'll come back to some questions around the DFE, because we've got some interesting comments coming in about the policy environment. I'm just going to go to the question posed by Catherine Zesserson first, which is really looking at the history of the different kinds of policy initiatives that have been made over the past 20 and 30 years. For example, we've had creative partnerships, we've had music manifestos, the Arts Council doing a pivot to include arts education very much as an expectation within national portfolio organisation funding as part of the Let's Create 10-year strategy that the Arts Council have developed. So Catherine has two questions. Sally, I'm going to come to you for the first question, which is, what is to be learned from the pendulum swings of the last 30 years that might inform tactics and strategy for the next wave of change?
Yeah, I think we covered this in some detail in the Gulbenkian Under New Direction Arts and Schools report from 2023. And what we talk about is decades of initiative-itis. absolutely decades of them. Great, some of them absolutely great. And they came and they went. And Estelle Morris herself has said, you know, where Labour got it wrong before was not to embed the arts in, you know, primary legislation for what actually happens in the mainframe of schools. And these, you know, creative partnerships, find your talent, all these things have come along over decades, but they were all sticking plasters on a problem that was already there, and a problem that's got, you know, really tough since 2010. I would completely agree with Ed. Just moving on from Catherine's point for a second about purposes, in our foundational arts, in our blueprint for an arts-rich education that we published before the last election, the very first thing is setting new purposes for education. It's the very first thing we talk about. A lot of the things we at the CLA do talk about aren't even about the arts. They're about quite fundamental things about our education system. And we want the expressive arts mapped on to those purposes. That's how you get this right. I think it's really, really important. So we can learn from all those things that have been and gone over the last few decades, but we only get it right now if we get the mainframe of it right. Those foundation stones have to be built for the arts to flourish, and we haven't had that. We've had very not very fertile soil for the arts in schools. Ken Robinson would like that phrase, but for a long time, and we have to have fertile soil going forward.
Thank you, Sally. I'm actually going to, Catherine, I'm going to come back to your second question because it's quite a nice reflective end question. So we'll hopefully have time to come back to that. Speech bubbles have also said, speaking, listening and communication needs are one of the most pressing issues for our children. 1.9 million with expression and understanding challenges in the classroom. How can we help government to understand that? They say it's important, but it was missing in the interim report. Geoff, I think I'll come to you because it does feel as though this also relates to the role that you played in chairing the Oracy Commission. So your reflections on that, please.
Sure. I mean, I think particularly, you know, people who are working in schools at the moment would say that we should be worried about children and young people without painting the picture of them always being victims in all of this. We should be worried because we are seeing that the obsession with screen time, the fact that, you know, Frank Cottrell-Boyce told me, and it's good evidence from the National Literacy Trust, the percentage of children who are read to by an adult before they go to primary school, right? 50%. So you got 50% of children are never read to by an adult at home. So this fundamental sense of how we listen, how we speak becomes more important. And what we did in our commission was assemble people who were not the usual group of suspects, right? So we had people who represented business and people who represented the arts, people representing not just familiar names. And that made it more challenging to chair, but we got a better report as a result of that. And what we were saying is, no one would disagree that reading, writing and arithmetic are foundations. They are the 3 R's. Speaking and listening, oracy, this ugly word oracy, should be the 4th R, and it should be seen as foundational. It underpins your ability to be a good mathematician. It underpins your ability to be able to read and talk about what you've read. And in an age when everyone is cross about everything all the time, the ability to be able to disagree agreeably has never been more important. So we come up with a report and we've got 60 podcasts where we talk to specialists about it, and it kind of gets noticed, right? And then we see the interim report, and the interim report doesn't use the word oracy at all. It doesn't really say anything about speaking and listening skills. And people were contacting me saying, oh, you need to make a big thing of this and you need to throw your toys out of the pram and say, you know, this is terrible. The way I saw that was a high-level report. What it was saying is, these are the kind of things we are now going to focus on, and these are the things we're going to drill into. And I had a conversation the day the report came out with Becky Francis, who we know is committed to oracy, right, and to the arts, but at the Education Endowment Foundation, they did reports about the importance of all of this stuff. You wouldn't find anyone who doesn't believe that oracy is more important than Becky Francis does. And she says to me, you can tell people, of course, oracy is going to show up. The question is, how does it show up? Because it's in the national curriculum at the moment. If you look at science and you look at maths, oracy is mentioned in the aims of science and maths. But the reality is, if you're a science teacher today, planning a lesson for tomorrow, you're not looking at the aims of your maths or the aims of your science. It needs to be in the granular bits of the curriculum. That's what they're moving into next. And I think we will have an influence on where that is. And I'm reassured by her, and she's happy for me to say that, of course, it's going to show up, and we will have a look at the detail of that. And I go back to my earlier point, Ollie de Botton, huge advocate of the kind of skills that you're talking about there, speech bubbles, great name, by the way, absolutely is committed to all of this. And it might just be that what we're seeing tonight is number 10 giving a greater emphasis to the skills agenda, because skills weren't mentioned enough in the report, as far as I was concerned, the interim report, and actually them saying it's not about skills versus knowledge. All of this matters, and all of children's learning will be underpinned by teaching them how to communicate and how to listen more effectively. And sorry, Jacqui, that was a very long answer.
Thank you. No, thank you so much, Geoff. And it takes us also into a question about teachers, which I'm going to come on to now. Clearly, Baz has talked about the numbers of the percentage reductions in expressive arts subject teachers that are in the system, and obviously that's an issue in terms of building then an arts-rich curriculum across secondary and across primary schools. So Laura from the British Library is asking, what do the panel think organisations in the arts sector can do to support teacher recruitment and teacher retention? I wonder, Janet, can I go to you first, and then I'm going to come to Derri to give a response to that question. Janet, from your experience, what do you feel, what do you want the arts sector to do in terms of its relationship to schools and teacher recruitment and retention?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, Derri, Curious Minds, you do a lot of work with professional artists and getting them into schools and working with young people, and maybe professional artists coming into education. We've seen some examples of that, Derri, haven't we, through your work at Curious Minds. I think would be really important. I also think it's about that collaboration between schools and education, and those art organisations is also really important, and then how they can bolster the education system.
Thank you, Derri.
I think Janet's answered in the way that I would really. I think there's a sense of joylessness sometimes in schools, unless you're in an arts-rich school, and we're lucky enough to go into lots of those. But there's lots of anecdotal evidence from projects that we and other organisations run, that when you bring artists and arts organisations into school to co-produce learning, that suddenly teachers feel reinvigorated and they remember why they came into the profession in the first place. We just need more of that. And I think there's also I've been saying this for a long time, there's an army of professional educators ready to support schools and to fill the gaps that have been left in the workforce. It doesn't necessarily need to be temporary, but we could mobilise teaching artists across the country very quickly to move into schools. We just need the resource to do it. And when I say we, I mean the sector. Not just the CLA, not just Curious Minds, but organisations like yours, Jacqui, or Shakespeare Company. We could very quickly mobilise very expert educators who aren't necessarily qualified teachers, but to support the arts education of children in schools more quickly than we could train new teachers.
I really agree, and also those reflections that both of you have made, Janet and Derri, of the impact that a partnership between a school and an arts organisation has on the teaching, on the morale of teachers in the school. Certainly, so recognise that sense of, it reminds me of why I came into the teaching profession and why I want to stay in it. That's another research project, isn't it, in itself? I'm going to now go to a comment from Lucy, which was about Paul Morrow at the APPG, so an all-parliamentary party group. These are groups that are formed, I'm sure lots of you know this, but groups that are formed which don't have a formal role within Parliament, but can influence and inform decision-making. So there's an APPG, all-party parliamentary group for art and design education, that met this week and talked about the fact that schools need to go back to the purpose of education, and about young people being good citizens. And I wondered, Sally, if you could come in at this point, because I was also tying that comment together with the interim curriculum review data about parents and young people and carers, 38% of them wanting to be involved in problem-solving projects and creative thinking projects and wanting things that relate to developing real life skills, and just the capabilities work that Cultural Learning Alliance has been doing, and the capabilities framework. Could you just give a little bit more colour around that, and perhaps about the information that's available about that for any of our colleagues to be using now?
Absolutely, Jacqui. And Jacqui's been chairing our evidence and value narrative group for the last year and a half that's really been taking a deep dive into all of this. We didn't know we were going to develop a capabilities framework, did we, Jacqui? That's what emerged. And there is something, and I know, Geoff, you'll be thinking about this with Oracy. It's how you frame, how you talk about something to get everyone to understand it's really, really important. I don't think we've cracked our value narrative. And in the arts sector more widely, actually, but for arts education. And even when writing the Arts and Schools report, I was annoying myself with the list of things I kept writing about all the great things the arts did. And what we've understood, what we've really had to think about in putting this together is it has to be evidenced. Eventually we'll have all these capabilities so you can click on them and get to the national and international evidence, the aggregated findings that tell us this does this. And the 7 things we're talking about, they were in the final slide, and we'll share the slides. We'll put those on the website, but there's an article actually on the CLA website and our latest thinking piece about the capabilities framework. They are agency, they are well-being, their communication, including Oracy, they are empathy, their collaboration, their creativity, and their interpretation. And Baz talked about that very well in terms of critical thinking and meaning making. These are the 7 things that we know the arts do. And we talk about them as in terms of personal benefit and societal benefits. And I think we have been struggling with a narrative from previous governments about strategically important subjects which haven't included the arts. The arts have been downgraded in the public discourse about why they're important for children and young people. All of those things that employers want, that young people need, they're in that capabilities framework. And if we start to talk about the arts, if we come back to the purposes of education and the purpose of studying arts education, so these are really important things. We are really excited about this capabilities framework because when we developed it, we were very much thinking about it for case making, actually, because we and others have to make the case all the time for arts education with policymakers and funders and all sorts of audiences, parents. But actually, when we've given it to teachers and school leaders, they've said, wow, this is a new lens. If I look at my arts delivery through this lens, and I'm absolutely sure Janet and Ed will already be doing this, but they start to think about their arts curriculum provisions slightly differently. And that's what we're really, really excited about at the moment. We're to keep testing it, we'll keep refining it. And we hope later in the year, it'll be absolutely mapped onto all the evidence we've gathered through rapid evidence reviews we're doing across the subjects at the moment. So yeah, exciting times. We're at exactly the right moment, actually, thank goodness.
Thank you, Sally. There's also a question that's coming, which I think is a really interesting one. Saul Argent has asked, is there also a push or a need for a push for more creativity across the curriculum? And Ed, I'd love to bring you in to respond to that because, of course, National Education Union, you're leading an Arts and Minds initiative. What's the relationship, do you think, to a strong expressive arts provision in schools and the need for creativity across the curriculum?
I think absolutely, we talked at length about trying to focus on arts subjects and not to call them creative subjects, because of course if any subject is taught well, it should have an element of creativity to it. It's exactly what Geoff was saying about Oracy, and it comes down to thinking skills essentially, and creativity is a state of mind as much as anything, and it is certainly not linked to the arts any more than any other subject. So I think that's really vital. There's clearly a separate issue with with the arts in schools. But I do think we need to have far more focus on creativity in education. I recently went to a conference in Australia, and I visited an Australian school, and I went into an art classroom and I saw a huge poster on the wall which a child had made, a piece of art, and it said, "Make more mistakes." And I thought that was a really fascinating thing. I absolutely loved it, and it summed up a lot of the way in which I tried to teach music, and a lot of that, of course, has been taken out of that by all the accountability and all the things that we've talked about. And a lot of that has been stripped out in many ways, and in many ways, we have focused so much on giving children the answers that we never thought to teach them which questions to ask. And how do I ask questions? Who do I ask them to? How do I know whether they're telling me the truth? How do I back that up? And then what do I do with that? And that kind of style of learning and that style of teaching is absolutely vital in all subjects. So I think there is a separate issue with the way in which the arts have been sidelined, but there's a far wider question. And, as I said, I think a conversation around what the purpose of education is, there's a far wider question and deeper question about creativity and how children think, I think is really, really vital. And it, again, goes back to what Geoff was saying about, there are the foundational skills, but critical thinking and oracy and formulating an argument and all of those things are being just gradually lost at a time when they're as important as ever.
Could I just quickly comment on that, Jacqui? Because the thing I would just draw out of what you've said, Ed, there, which is so helpful, is we're not saying that the expressive arts are the creative things and the other subjects aren't. Interestingly, the Oracy thing, if you listen to the podcast with David Thomas, the area that good Oracy teaching will make the biggest impact on is children's ability in maths. The kids who do best in maths in the world, they're in Russia, they're in Hong Kong, they're in Shanghai, they're in Finland, is because maths is not a solitary activity of right and wrong answers. It is about collaborating, explaining and justifying your answer, and then debating how you reached it. And the best book on all of that stuff, Graham Nuttall's extraordinary book, what he reminds us is that you can teach as a teacher the same lesson, exactly the same lesson on the same day to two different classes. One lesson, it'll work brilliantly. One, it'll be mediocre. And that sense that we're not just giving agency back to children, but to teachers so that they're making decisions and learning from stuff, whether they're maths teachers, PE teachers, whatever they are. I think we need to do that if we're going to get people choosing to become teachers instead of going into management consultancy and all the rest of it.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. So we've just got time for a couple more questions and observations. So NSEAD, thank you for your validating comment about the value of the report card and how useful you're finding that. Sally, would you like to come in just in terms of the comment particularly about that stark decline in total teaching hours for art and design of 18.1%?
Yeah, and we took issue, we were broadly positive about the curriculum interim report. One of the issues, the absence of Oracy was one of the issues we took it out of it, and one of them was just we didn't think it reflected the nuance, all the things, dense things going on around art and design in particular. And we have quite a detailed explanatory note at the forefront of our report card specifically about art and design as it relates to the massive decline in design and technology, a lot of which is probably explained by people moving across to lower cost specifications in the art and design A level. It's quite complicated. So I think where we see things that are quite, presented in quite a straightforward way about subjects, sometimes we would really challenge. And I say about the report card, if you dig for one subject, just take one subject and just read it, highlight the bits about one subject, you get a whole story that wouldn't even fit on Baz's slides. There's a drama story that's really interesting. There's a music story, and all of them sort of beg more questions. That's what's so fascinating about it. So we really hope that those curriculum assessment review subject deep dives that happen now really do that, and just don't take a figure and say that subject's fine. We know that's not the case. We know that's a very, very partial picture. So I just wanted to sort of really validate the National Society for Education, Art and Design's point there, really.
Thank you, Sally. We're going to move to just some final reflections from panellists now. And I'm going to go back to Catherine Zesterson's second question, which is where Catherine was really asking about levers for change. So I would love each of the panellists to reflect on, in the light of the data that we've had presented so brilliantly by Baz tonight, and Baz, I'd love you to reflect as well in this. So in the light of that, and in the light of the context that we are in, of an interim curriculum and assessment review report with the final report coming out in November, and the announcement of the National Centre for Arts and Music Education, and whatever that means, what does each of the panellists feel is the key lever that we need to see that will create the kind of change that we all believe needs to happen to get an arts-rich entitlement for all children and young people? So that lever could be related to the curriculum review, it could be something different, or it could be related to the proposed National Centre. We're going to get a final reflection from each person. I'm going to start with Geoff.
Okay, as a grizzled old campaigner, my answer is there is no single lever to this. We delude ourselves if we think the curriculum review is going to transform children's experience, right? There is one thing we haven't mentioned though, which I learned from working with the NEU actually on campaigning around funding. We need parents in the run-up to the next election to be saying, hang on a minute, you promised that the arts were going to be more important. You talked about children flourishing and so on. What have you done around that? Parents need to be asking for this as an entitlement for their children, particularly in those areas where parents haven't got the time to ask for it, those disadvantaged communities. And I think there's some really interesting campaigning to do that, but if we're going to get politicians to really take notice of how important this is.
Thank you, Geoff. Janet, could I bring you in next?
I think there's two things for me. I think, coming back to what Geoff said at the beginning about that accountability, we need that legislation and that statutory guidance on arts entitlement and what that should look like in schools and how many hours a week that would look like. And then also the EBAC review, so that, we do have that creative pot. So there are something for everybody, because if children are picking option subjects that give them passion and purpose and fulfillment, it will lead to that flourishing ethos that Geoff has spoken about tonight.
Thank you, Janet. Baz.
I think that anyone trying to make the case for policy change or the introduction of new programs to improve access to the arts, Westminster is one option, but also a really exciting option is to various devolved powers in this country. There's a lot of new powers that Metro mayors, for example, have been given in the new devolution white paper, unring-fence funding relating to education and skills, the growth and skills levy that's coming in to eventually replace the apprenticeship levy. It's going to be very focused on young people's access to skills. I was making this point actually on a panel with Geoff last week, and someone came up to me from the London Mayor's office and or working in the London Mayor's team, and told me that they had actually been using these new powers to introduce Oracy interventions into primary school. So Metro mayors are already making use of these powers, for example, with the Manchester Baccalaureate in Manchester. And yeah, they're a really key target here, I think, for driving some actual policy change on the ground without going through the intransigence of working with Westminster, I think.
Great point, thank you. Derri.
For me, I think thinking about the new National Centre and what that could do, I think there's a real danger that legislation can demand more arts in schools without really getting to the critical question of quality. Because for me, the entitlement gap and the enrichment gap especially doesn't appear because of not enough arts. A lot of the time it's because children aren't getting access to high quality arts learning experiences. That's where the gap is. And I think the way to address that for me is to have much stronger partnerships between the education sector and the cultural sector. So we can't ignore putting investment into the cultural sector to strengthen what is a very weak learning and participation ecology now post-COVID. So I think we can't do one without the other. There's a real danger that all the focus goes on doing more in schools without thinking about bringing the expertise from the cultural sector into schools to really drive up quality, because that's where the equality sits for me.
Thank you, Derri. And Ed.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, so I think really, personally, I would get rid of the e-back tomorrow. I think it would be cost neutral. I think it would send the right message, and I don't think adding a new bucket is good enough. I think it still stratifies subjects, and we need to, if we're talking about a broad and balanced curriculum, then you know, we need to have that conversation on a flat playing field. I think there's an elephant in the room with all of this. Derri just talked about investment, and of course, without funding, any of this is pretty moot. And one of the things that we at the NEU find, and you know, Geoff mentioned our campaigning on school cuts that our school were a huge part of as well. But one of the things that we find very, very difficult is that you can have a good conversation with the DFE, but ultimately what the DFE can do, what the DFE can deliver, and then what schools can do and deliver, and what teachers can do and deliver in class. Really the power to change all of that lies at the Treasury, and schools funding in particular, and arts funding, cultural funding, local authority funding. All of these things have been absolutely stripped back, and you know, in the arts sector more widely, you know, much deeper than schools, but they have been stripped back to a point where, without serious investment from the Treasury, some of this stuff that we're talking about is just going to be theory, because in practice, you know, part of the reason music has gone off a cliff in schools is it's quite expensive to buy musical instruments. So certainly, you know, pianos cost more than exercise books, and that, you know, that's a little bit glib, but it's true, and it's absolutely the case in design and technology with smaller class sizes and the tools that are required. It's the case in art. These things cost. It costs money to run smaller classes often, which is why you get this, you know, the effect with the A-level fall off. I mean, you know, much of the A-level drop off is schools just saying, actually, we can't run a class of 5 anymore. So I think, you know, in short, whatever we do and whatever we decide and whatever we are campaigning for, we have to do it alongside campaigning for more funding for the arts in general and education.
Thank you. Sally.
Yeah, we have our blueprint for an arts rich education. We're just asking for 4 fundamental things to shift, and then we've got some principles around those. We'll review that when we have the curriculum review, but the curriculum review report is not, as Geoff said, it's not a silver bullet, not least because it doesn't touch workforce, which is a massive, massive issue. But I agree with everything everyone said, and I think Geoff's point about parents in just this value narrative that is a bigger issue than just us. It's a societal issue, actually, about reframing how we talk about the arts and their value in our world, and not least because of everything going on in the US at the moment. I was reading a humanities piece of research today from an agency in the States about arts and humanities being the canaries in the coal mine, and once they start to suffer, then lots of other things start to flow from that. So about the centre, you know, we've all got to come together to make that the thing it needs to be, and not the thing it, you know, could fall into being. I would say we all love music. It's divisive to separate it in the title, and we have said that in our newsletter. But, you know, we've all got to be positive and travel hopefully, and travel optimistically about the centre and the curriculum review. But I think Ed's point about money is really, really important.
Thank you all so much for your really invaluable insights, and to the CLA and BAS for a fabulous report card, which all of us will be using now in all of our different spheres. Thank you all so much for joining us. We'll end the webinar there.